And thank you, DPM, Teo Chee Hean, and Minister Chan for gracing this occasion. Minister Chan, DPM, as it so happens, had to travel to Riyadh to attend the funeral of the late King, and flew in just this morning to be here with us this afternoon. I don't know why, but almost every Singapore Perspectives conference occurs just when a major news event has happened. 2 years ago, when we planned, when we had the Prime Minister here, we had not counted for a by-election to be held on the very eve of the Singapore Perspectives. So we had a very exciting Singapore Perspectives 2 years ago. This year, we had no idea when we planned for Singapore Perspectives today that just last Friday we had some news about Minister Chan. So this is just the luck of the draw. Neither DPM nor Minister Chan need any introduction. DPM has been in politics since 1992, having served as Chief of Navy before that, and he has been Deputy Prime Minister since 2009. Minister Chan came in the last general election, having served as Chief of Army, and has been serving as Minister for Social and Family Development for the past 2 years. This will be a very free-flowing, wide-ranging discussion, as most of you who have attended previous Singapore Perspectives know. We will have as many of you ask questions as possible, and both DPM and Minister Chan will answer your questions to the best of their abilities. I can't, given my age, I don't exactly have sight of the entire room. So if I fail to see you, make some noise decorously so that I know that you're there, and I will call upon you. And I'll do my best to allow as many of you as possible to ask questions. Keep your questions short so that we can get through as many questions as possible. And if they are too long, I will interrupt in order to cut you off. So please, let's start with the first question. I have, I think, Asad Latif, who has been assigned to ask the first question, of, and then we will throw it up to the rest of the audience. Yes. Where's Asad? Where are they?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. DPM TO and...
Where are you, Asad?
I'm
here. Okay. Yes, over there.
Right. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah. DPM, there has been a lot of discussion lately about the role of history in the formation of Singapore's national identity. You were only 11 years old when Singapore became independent. Did you personally expect Singapore to grow up so fast and even have the luxury of debating these questions of national identity? What is it in those years of Singapore, in the early years of Singapore, that have made this confidence possible, this, if you like, historical assertiveness possible? In other words, how was the groundwork laid for what Singapore is today? And in the same vein, if I could ask Minister Chan, much younger, according to you, from a different perspective, age perspective perhaps, generational perspective perhaps, what were the formative influences and ideas of Singapore which give you hope that this place, this country of ours, will cohere? What were those ideas? So, a question for both of you, please.
Well, as an 11-year-old, I think my thoughts about what the nation would be were probably not very well formed, as the thoughts of most 11-year-olds would be, even today. I was probably thinking of whether I could go out to play marbles or whatever it is. But I think it's interesting that, when you live through a certain period of time, I still remember having to stand up when you go to the movies, Cathay or Lido Theatre, and God Save the Queen is played at the beginning of every movie. When I went to school, I went to a Chinese kindergarten for 1 year. I studied in an English school, but I studied both Malay and Chinese when I was in primary 1 and 2. And then in primary 3, my father had to decide whether I would take Malay or I would take Chinese. And that was the momentous year of 1963. So my father decided for me that I should take Malay. And it's not something I've ever regretted. And those are the kinds of things which affect you in your identity as you go through life. I remember in secondary school, because I took Malay, I would go to Jalan Yunos and take part in Malay oratorical contests. My Malay was good enough to take part in oratorical contests, but not in debates. Because debates, you have to think on your feet and find the words and gather them immediately. So I could speak quite impressively of a script or something that was prepared. But I used to go to Jalan Yunos, and with where Ampat PM was, the Malay Youth Literary Society, and take part in debates with them. And those were some of the formative ideas that I had, which shaped the way I think and the way that I think about Singapore and Singaporeans. And I remember that my late grandmother, bless her soul, she was born in 1902. In the 1960s, we, just over dinner and conversation, we talk about social attitudes, and she would say in Teochew, "Nang teng nang, we Chinese," and I would say, "No, nang Singapore nang, we Singaporeans," and she probably thought I was being rude to her, but these were the differences in social attitudes and the way we thought about ourselves as we evolved. In 1966, when we first said the pledge, I actually was on television every evening or every morning when the national anthem is played, when Radio and Television Singapore comes on, because they came to my school to film young students taking the pledge, and I was the one who was raising the flag, because I was the head prefect. So I could watch myself raising the flag every day. And this has a profound impact on you and your sense of national identity. And national service, of course, is a very defining sort of thing. And your thoughts about race and so on get shaped through your experiences. I remember as an NCC cadet, we didn't have enough water bottles to go around. You'll probably be horrified by this idea, but when we went for field camp, we used to share water bottles. So between two people, we would have a water bottle, and my buddy was Indian. So we would share water bottles. You take a drink whenever you need one, and I'll take a drink whenever we need one, and we thought nothing of it. And national service is a defining experience. And interestingly enough, when I went overseas, it's the first time I went to UK, went anywhere further than Penang when I was 19 years old to study. And that somehow eventually made me feel even more attached to Singapore and what Singapore is. Because you have a sense that there's something that you've got here special, and it's something which you want to do. So what were the fundamentals that helped to shape us what we are today? I understand you had a big debate on pragmatism. I think pragmatism certainly had a lot to do with it. But I would say that because of the cauldron from which we came, the cauldron of crisis from which we came, there was a sense that, if you don't get this right, we are finished. So there was a consensus that we needed to do things together, different races, different religions, that each of us had to invest something in this to create Singapore and not just fight for our own factional or segmented sectoral interests. And I think that had a lot to do with it. Certainly good charismatic leadership from Mr. Lee and his team that helped to point the direction, set the direction, and also give us those fundamentals which I think are still true today. Meritocracy, multiracialism, incorruptibility, and self-reliance. And those are as much a part of our national character and identity as many of the other aspects. So it's not a specific answer, but a sort of almost impressionistic answer coming from my own experiences growing up in that period, up to say about the middle 80s. Maybe that's a good time to hand over to Chun Sing.
Thanks, DPM. I was born in 1969, just straight after the race riots. Of course, when I was born, I would know that the race riot had just happened a month before my birth. But my experience, my formative experience, were perhaps a bit different, because by the time I was born, I think everyone was calling themselves a Singaporean. And as I grew up in a primary school and secondary school, pretty much everybody thought that, well, it's just natural that we are all Singaporeans. But I thought that if I have to reflect back, there were some episodes that really triggered me to think and ask myself, what does it mean to be a Singaporean, and what does our national identity really mean? And perhaps I'll just share with you a couple of stories that shaped my thinking. When I was studying in Cambridge, I did economics and politics, and as any good student in Cambridge, you don't study the subject that you're supposed to study, so I read history. And I began to wonder, when was the last time that there was such a term called Singaporeans? So if I look back at the Cambridge history, and they have this series on the Cambridge history, there wasn't really a time in the last 500-600 years where this place by itself was ever independent. It was always part of some larger entity. We were part of Malaya. Prior to that, we were part of the British Empire. We had the part of our history as being occupied by the Japanese. Before the British came, we were probably part of some sultanate from Johor to Malacca, part of the Srivijaya Empire, Majapahit. And I began to think that actually it's quite odd and quite rare for us to be where we are today, in this unique moment of history where we are known to be independent. And just to reinforce that, when I was even in the military, sometimes in our conversations with other people, we tend to think that, well, I'm a Singaporean, so everybody must accept that I am an independent country, and people should know that I'm from an independent country. I was talking to one of these military commanders, very senior military commanders from one of the very established armed forces around the world. He thought that the people of Singapore were called Singaporees. And he was supposed to be in charge of this region, you see. So it just, and when I went to Indonesia as the army attaché, I began to realize how small we are as a country compared to Indonesia. This particular regional commander in Indonesia, in East Java, asked me, why do you come and see me, and why do you want to come and see me? Where is this place called Singapore? Oh, you happen to be in the southern part of Malaysia. Oh, I see. Malaysia, that's quite small compared to my province. So, some of these moments, you begin to reflect back and say that, actually, maybe we are quite unnatural as a country. And we have defied the odds all this while because we have been pretty pragmatic in the way we do things. We desire to remain independent. But this, being independent, this is not so easy because not everybody wants to pay the price for this. I once talked to the freedom fighters in Papua province in Indonesia, and they told me they want to be independent as well. I asked them why. They couldn't really articulate it. And more importantly, they weren't really able to say why they want to be independent and whether they were prepared to pay the price to be independent. to have their own defense, to have their own foreign policies, to have their own economic strategy, and so forth. So I thought, if you ask me, on hindsight, with my short little experience, this desire to be independent and want to dictate and control our way of life, I think it's something that is rather unique, that defines our experience of trying to be a nation. But having said this, we are now actually at a crossroad. The concept of national identity has probably two dimensions, not mutually exclusive, but probably two dimensions. Most countries in the world define their identity on an exclusive term, me versus you. And the exclusivity tend to be backward looking. We all come from the same race, we speak the same language, we have the same religion, and so on and so forth. Or we come from the same geographical area in some parts of the world. There are some merits to this concept of exclusivity and some ease of building up a sense of identity from this. But this exclusiveness also tends to have its own sense of danger, where people become parochial, unable to accept ideas. And it tends to be more backward-looking, and that is the weakness of this particular concept. But there's also another concept where people build their identity on, and this is a forward-looking concept. A concept that says that while we may come from different lands, we may have different race, language, religion, but we all share the same common ideal of how our society should be run, what kind of systems of governance, and so forth. Whether it's meritocracy, multiracialism, incorruptibility, values that define us. If you look around the whole world, very few countries define their national identity not just with a backward-looking, exclusive way, but also with a forward-looking, inclusive way. Our challenge, I think, going forward in the next era is really to find that balance. We need something of the past to anchor us to the collective memories that we have gone through, to fight for independence for our country, to survive as a little country, SARS, economic crisis, and what have you, that have bonded us together as a nation. But going forward, we also need to ask ourselves, what is that set of ideals that will help to unite us and also allow us to draw in fresh perspective, new energy as we go forward. If we can find that balance between the two, then I'm very confident that going forward, we will have a very strong sense of what does it mean to be a Singaporean, not just looking at the past, but also looking at the future.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. I turn my attention to this side of the hall now, and if somebody could ask a question from this side. Anybody? Yes.
Puak Kai Hong from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I noticed our two guests of honor have got military backgrounds and are very strategic, and they're thinking, well, around the turn of the millennium, Minister Teo, you came for the Red Cross strategic planning meeting that General Winston Chu and ourselves organized. And Minister Chan, you are now bringing your military strategic planning in the social sector and also now to the trade unions recently. So what is significant is that our strategic path now have gone from the very pragmatic need to survive into now trying to balance some welfare needs. So is it another pragmatic approach? Are we really concerned about not just being populist and responding to what the population wants?
You want to take it from there?
Yeah.
You answers all the tough questions.
I think it's a false dichotomy to say that whether we are pragmatic or we are idealistic. You can't be pragmatic if there's no idealism to guide you. And you can't be idealistic and expect things to happen if you're not pragmatic.
You should have been here earlier.
No, I mean, let's take social policies as an example. Our goal as a country has always been to take care of everyone, regardless of race, language, religion. we strive to make sure that we uplift those with the least. That is our ideals. Then the question is, how do we try to uplift those with the least? One of the guiding philosophy in my ministry is that we will try to do the most for those with the least. And if I poll the audience here, would you all agree with me that in trying to uplift everybody in society, we should try to do the most for the least? Would anybody disagree with this as an ideal? No? So, or maybe I ask the other way. This is a bit like an opt-in versus opt-out question. If I ask it the other way around, affirmatively, answer, how many of you agree that we should do the most for those with the least as an ideal? Right.
Okay.
So we all agree on this. Now that's the easy part. Then the question becomes tricky when you try to implement policies. The question is, what do you mean by doing more, and who are those with the least? Right? Who are those with the least? And I'll just share with you one very tangible example from the early childhood sector. Once upon a time, we had a universal subsidy for everybody. $300 regardless of race, language, religion, family, or everybody in the early childhood sector. $300 subsidies to help families to defray the cost of early childhood services. In the last few years, we have moved away from such things. We have moved towards a more targeted policies whereby the poorest families, those with less than $1,000 income, can get early childhood services for less than $3 per month per child. And even for many of these families, the community will raise the money to cover them. Some of you might ask, why not just give it for free? The only reason we put a token sum is because we want to give each and every of the family a sense of ownership and responsibility. And if you are in the social service sector, you will know that helping is one thing. It's not good as a policy and as a practice to take away people's dignity and pride and their sense of being able to participate in their own solution seeking. So now, in order for us to do the most for the least, for those with the least, which means that over time, over the scale, those with more, we will give them a bit less help because we have focused more of our resources to the last 10-20% to help them most. And I think all of you who have so kindly voted for that philosophy and idealism just now would agree with me that this is the correct way to do things, right? When the policy came out, not many people went to my Facebook page to say how great an idea it was. Many people who earn $7,501 per month went to my Facebook page and say, why didn't I get more subsidy than my neighbor? And some of them who got a few $100s was initially happy until he saw the neighbor getting a few $100s more than him. Now, this goes to the nub of our challenges. We know what is the correct thing to do the most for those with the least. But in execution, it is not so straightforward because we have to contend with human dynamics. And it is very difficult to do this. Many people believe that they should get more help. But many people who ask for more help sometimes forget that actually they are already getting quite a bit of help. And for those who have more help given to them, they actually need it much more. But if everybody fight for it just for ourselves, then we will go back to the system whereby we pretend to help everybody equally, and in the end, helping nobody. So this is something that we have to grapple with. Just another story. I was talking to a group of very eminent people. They were all talking about the middle class squeeze, and I have a lot of sympathy for this conversation of how the families are struggling and so forth. And they use their own personal example. So they say that we should do more for the middle class, so on and so forth. And I explain to them what we are going to do, what we have done, and so forth. And incidentally, towards the end of the conversation, I happened to ask them, I say, how many of you pay income tax? Because in Singapore, only the top 30% of the income earners pay income tax. All of us pay GST and so forth. Strangely, the whole hall all put up their hands to say that they pay income tax. But they all believe that they are all middle class, and they all believe that more should be given to help them. So sometimes I think we need to have a very honest conversation with ourselves, how we organize ourselves as a society to really live up our idealism of doing more for those with less. And in executing this, we have to be frank with ourselves whether we are one of those with less and therefore we need more from society. If we can come to a nice social compact and nice understanding of this, I think we'll be much stronger for it. And our resources, our finite resources, will be much more targeted to have greater impact on those who need it the most.
Maybe I just pick up a couple of points from there. Well, this idea that now it's time to start looking after the welfare of people, especially those who are from sort of who are less well off. It seems to presuppose that this is not something which we've been doing all along. And I would say that the great policies that we have implemented since independence have really largely been directed at uplifting those in the most difficult parts of society. And the great policies include things like health, education, and housing. And these are tremendous policies which have uplifted the great mass of Singaporeans to a level which really is the envy of the world. I mean, at the time that I was born, I think the life expectancy for a male was probably around 59. So I would have exceeded that already by now. Right? But today it's what, 80 plus. Housing, people were living in shanties without sanitation. I grew up in a reasonably comfortable home, but my home was served by the bucket system when I was young. But it was a relatively comfortable home, but people were living in shanties. People were living piled on top of each other in Chinatown. And education was for the privileged or for a few. And today, education is widespread and widely available to everyone, including those with disability. And so these are the big social policies which really have uplifted the mass of Singaporeans. And it's a massive social change which has included Singaporeans in the success of Singapore in a way which many countries have failed to do. So when we talk about income inequality and so on, we have to look at these elements of what has happened in Singapore. There's another perspective which I would like to share. And what we're doing now is we're adjusting some of our policies because the society has changed. We did not have a major issue with aging before. But today, a very large proportion of Singaporeans are going to be over the age of 80. The fastest growing segment is probably those who will be living alone and aging. Largely because their children have their own homes. They may be living close by, but they're living on their own. They may be single, spouse may have passed away, the children may have flown the nest. So that's a very large proportion. And we have to readjust some of our health policies in order to take care of this group. And hence we have the Pioneer Generation Package. It's to take care of the pioneers and to recognize their contributions to the Singapore we have today, but to address a very real need and concern that they have, which is healthcare. And also MediShield Life. And these two things, MediShield Life will bring everybody in for life and including pre-existing conditions. But the design of the MediShield Life has to be in such a way that it's sustainable. Because if you look at the health systems, the welfare systems of the countries in Europe, they are having to cut back on overly generous systems, and because they have not given enough emphasis on earning the dollar before spending it, a number of those countries have now gone into very serious crisis. So it's also important that when you make a promise, that you're actually able to keep that promise. If you make a promise and you're not able to keep the promise, or you're writing a check on somebody else's account, then that's not really a promise. And the worst promise to make is if you write a check on your children's account on money which they haven't earned yet. And that we want to avoid doing by making sure that the programs and the policies that we've put in place are able to be sustained over time. The second aspect of this is, it's not how much redistribution you do per se, but what you actually spend the money on. You can spend a lot of money, for example, on providing rental housing for those who have no homes or who need homes. But we have decided to spend the money on very large housing subsidies to help people own their own homes. That has an entirely different effect on inclusiveness, on a sense of ownership, and a sense of belonging to Singapore. We have not done unemployment benefits, but we've done workfare and we've done skills training. That has a much more important long-term effect on the earning capability and the self-dignity of individuals. So it's not what is the extent of the redistribution, but how you do it, and whether you're able to sustain it in the long term without signing checks on your children's accounts.
I think a lot of people would like to focus on the transfer, how much we are spending to transfer between the highest income tier to the lowest. That is one dimension. But really, if you look at what we have been doing in the last few years, the focus is not just the amount of transfer. That is the easy part. The focus is really on how can we help the low-income earners to uplift themselves, to help the middle-income earners to keep pace in the global competition. I don't know whether you all have been keeping track of CNA's recent series on Don't Call Us Poor. You will know that some of the challenges at that end of the spectrum is very multifaceted, very complex. It is one thing to just give out some token cash or financial assistance, but that may not resolve their problem. Very often, in the next lap of our social services, we have to emphasize on helping people to stand up, to be independent. We have to mobilize volunteers to contribute their time and talent, not just their treasures. Time and talent to come and handhold many of these families. Their challenges is not for lack of money per se. That is a symptom. Their challenges very often arise from the inability to do simple financial planning, investing in their children's education, providing a positive role model, providing a stable home environment so that the next generation can be uplifted. And that is where I think we need to put our focus on in the next lap. Beyond just the transfer. The transfer, as what DPM say, we have been able to do that to uplift the broad middle. The end of the spectrum that MSF is most concerned with, I think that requires even more intensive intervention than just transfer. And if you are talking about a generational issue, I'm very happy that the Pioneer Generation Package wasn't a promise on the future generation's ability to pay. We locked up all we think that we need to finance the package for the rest of the many years. Otherwise, actually, we will end up like some other countries where there's an intergenerational fight, where the government promises on behalf of future government, and then the future electorate, they will know what to do when the time comes.
Next question. Am I not seeing somebody? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Niam Shitong. I just had a question to Minister Chan regarding the Pioneer Generation Package. You mentioned that you're confident it will be fully funded as now. But my question is, do you really believe that you will not extend eligibility to the package beyond whatever cut-off date you have now? Is it politically tenable not to extend in the future?
The next Pioneer Generation. Is that what you're saying? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
So 2 quick answers to that. In fact, this is a question that is very commonly asked by many of my residents. When will I become the next Pioneer Generation? And my answer, frankly speaking, is this. Frankly speaking. Okay. We also hope that in future, we will be able to give a Pioneer Generation Package number 2. But that is premised on a few factors. Number 1, do we have the means to do so? Will we still be in a happy situation where we have the means to do so? Number 2, will our society have the similar values to want to honor those who are old and have contributed? You must have the means and you must have the will, right? Do you have a good government that can master the resources, mobilize the public opinion to do this? It's easy to promise, but will we actually be able to deliver? It depends on the capabilities of the government, it depends on the capabilities of the society, the willingness of our society to do so. But perhaps the more important question behind your question is that, how can we avoid a situation whereby government policies, particularly government subsidies, turn into an auction in election? We have seen this happen in many countries all over the world. In trying to get elected, somebody will stand up and say, I promise more than the next guy. And after a while, the whole system unravels. This is unfortunately one of the challenges of any political system. That it is always easy for someone to come and do a one-upmanship and say that I will promise more. Now, the only way to check against this is not a political system per se, but it is an enlightened electorate. Whenever someone promises to do more, we obviously have to ask the question, how do you balance the books and how are you going to bring that about? Those are tough questions. And it is only responsible for any political parties who promise to do more to similarly say, how are you going to do it? From what means, in what ways, and in what magnitude. Otherwise, there is no foolproof way to say that our elections will not turn into an auction. So you are right. Today, we honor those who are 65 years old and above. It's easy for someone to come and say, I will move it to 60. I will give even more. The question is, how do we do it? We want to be in a happy situation to uplift our people and do much more. But that must go back to our ability to do so, our collective will to do so, and most importantly, we must focus our attention and resources on those areas that require the most help and not turn it into an auction.
Well, just one small personal note here. As someone who also missed the Pioneer Generation package by just a few years, we hope that you will come to the next cabinet will come to the right decision. You know what to do if you want my vote.
Actually, it's not that far-fetched. Actually, if you look around the world, there are many countries today where the electoral politics is divided between different generations, right? And some people will say that, you know, my generation will outvote yours, you. So I think this is something that we have to be very careful with.
Gillian, you wanted to ask a question?
Gillian, go first.
Firstly, to Minister Chan, you talked about the issue of how to do it. I think one difficult choice that we had to make in the past 2 years was about the population question. So while many people who spoke up said we'd like to see a trimming of the numbers of foreign workers in Singapore, I'm not sure many people talked about how to do it. While the government proposed a halving of that number, the government also proposed a doubling of that productivity rate, doubling of the historic productivity rate. So how do we get to the point where we have that enlightened citizenry you talked about, especially as we see political pluralism grow? And over to DPM, I think in the first session today, Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan said that for Singapore as a small state to make its way in the world, it has to be extraordinary. And to be extraordinary and relevant. And to be extraordinary and relevant, we have to have success in what we do, and certainly that's economic success. So as you, sir, also chair the Productivity Council, I think, what are the difficult dilemmas that you face? Workers, businesses, government, strategic choices that will have to be made this year and going forward in order to make that transition to a low growth, though high base economy that has half of what it had in terms of worker growth rates and still be happy, thriving, and have enough money set aside so that you can have a Pioneer Generation package when your time comes.
I think you take this question first. Yeah.
The population issue is not something that is easy to communicate to the mass public. And that's because there are many dimensions to it, and it involves very long-term implications. Every society would obviously aspire to keep its society unique, has its own sense of identity, and every society will obviously feels a bit uneasy if the number of foreigners amongst them is too high. That's from the social perspective. Then there is the hard economics perspective. Singapore is a population of about 3.5 million real Singaporeans. If you strip away the very old and the very young who are not in the workforce, our Singaporean core workforce is about 2+ million. And that is what we have to do to compete with some of the mega cities around the world. A typical megapolis like Beijing, Shanghai, Tokyo, Yokohama, their population is about 20 million as a conurbation. That's about almost 10 times our size. And there's another unique thing about those cities compared to ours. In any big city with a large hinterland, their people rotate in and out. And usually the economically active one rotate into the cities, the economically less active one rotate out of the city. So even amongst their 20 million population, you can bet that the proportion of economically active and people will be very high. And that's the nature of all global cities. They attract people who are energetic, dynamic, and then energetic and dynamic people make their fortunes there, and then they may rotate out of the cities. We don't have that option. We are a city-state. Our 2.5 million economically active people must take care of the 3.5 million regardless. Whether you move from Changi to Jurong to Woodlands, you are still in Singapore. So the question is, how do we compete to make ourselves relevant to the rest of the world to earn a living? It's not an easy question to answer. There will be new industries that are never in Singapore ever before. We want to bring them in because we want to provide new opportunities for our younger generation. Otherwise, without new industries, our younger generation will take over the jobs of the previous generation, earning the pay and salaries of the previous generation, competing in what we call the red ocean of the last generation. That is a challenge. Then the second possibility that we need some foreigners are, we need skill to compete. Although that is not a desired outcome, and we would rather much compete on quality than on price or skill. Then the question is, how can we encourage our 2.5 million to be as productive as we can be, to compete based on the quality of our ideas rather than the quantity of our inputs or the price of our products. It is easy in theory, it is not so easy in practice. Even if we have to turn over our economy into a new high-wage economy, it takes time for the industries to turn this over, which is why we have been going on and on about having to raise our productivity. Some of you will still remember, I think I learned this when I was young, the productivity, the Timmy, the bee. We have been saying this ever since I was in primary school. And we will continue to say this because we really need to uplift the productivity in order to uplift the salaries and wages of our workers. We need to invest in them, change the processes so that we are more productive than other people who have much more labor, land, and resources than us. We have no other option. But having said that, in any global economy, in order to be a niche, as part of the global chain, the global value-added chain, you need to be of a certain size. The question is, can we do that with a 2-point-something million population? I won't dare say it's impossible, but I know it's very difficult. Because you can see some other economies of that size, even with a hinterland, it's very difficult for them to provide the kind of opportunities for their younger generation. And if we can't provide the opportunities for our younger generation, we might inadvertently trigger a cascade effect. That the best and brightest, the very capable ones in our society decides to go elsewhere to seek their fortunes. It's not a problem per se. The question is, as they see the world as their oyster, would they come back and call Singapore home? Or will we end up like some places where they have very good schools, they bring up very talented people, But all these talented people get absorbed by some other cities, and then we are just a satellite revolving around that mega conurbation. That will be quite sad for us. So I think we have to strike the balance. We have to bring in some people that will add to Team Singapore at a rate which we can assimilate, digest. And that is where we go back to just now where I was mentioning. Our sense of identity also have to find that balance between exclusivity, backward-looking, and inclusivity, forward-looking. If we can do that well, then we will be able to strengthen Team Singapore for the years to come. But this is a challenge which will continue with us so long as we are Singapore, the little red dot. It is our fate of life that we will have to compete in this hyper-competitive economy, given our natural, finite resources.
Maybe I can make some comments on population and then talk a little bit about productivity. Can you help me with slide 25, Wanyong, on our population pyramid? Let's see whether this works. So halfway through the session, you have to have some pictures to help everybody keep awake and pay attention. Have you got the slides up?
There it is. Okay.
Slide 25, if I can.
The pyramid.
Yeah. Back up some more. 2 more. Can you back up 2 more? The population pyramid. That's one. So if you look on the left, that's where we are roughly today, 2013. Left, blue color, this is being very sexist, blue color males, red color females, stacked up by age groups in five-year intervals. And this is what we look like today on the left. The baby boomers are sort of just below that little green line there, which is the roughly the 65-year-old green line. And that includes people like me who are going to go beyond 65 over the next 5 to 10 years. There's a little mini boom at around the 20+ mark, and that is the 1988 to 1997 mini baby boom, which we had from the 1988 Dragon year until 1997, after which birth fell off again. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, that's the picture for 2050, if there's no immigration. It is top-heavy, and there's a very small base in which to support everyone. If we go to the next slide, this shows that if you have no immigration, by 2025, the Singapore citizen population will start to decline. It will start to fall. It's a fate that's befalling Japan today, where you have an older population, and the population has already started to decline. One of the more, how shall I say, interesting statistics which I got from Japan is that there are more adult diapers being sold each year than there are baby diapers. That's quite a startling statistic. More adult diapers being sold than baby diapers. If you go to the next slide, this is what is actually happening with our citizen workforce. Now, this is a snapshot from 2030. The 2 vertical bars are roughly, the right vertical bar is age 65, and the left vertical bar is roughly age 20, 25. So that shows, the left vertical bar shows the number of people coming into the workforce at around age 20, 25. And the right vertical bar shows the number of people leaving the workforce in 2030 at around age 65. So you can see that the right side is a lot bigger than the left side, where the vertical bars are. And this is a totally new phenomenon, because if you look to the right side of the right vertical bar, you will see how rapidly those numbers have grown over the last few years. And prior to this, we had always been in a situation where those leaving the workforce, the citizens leaving the workforce, had been smaller than the citizens entering the workforce on the left side. So this is a totally new phenomenon. And what it means is that if you go to the next slide, if you take roughly 65 years old as the cutoff age, 1970 there were 13.5 citizens to 1 over the age of 65. 13 citizens of, say, roughly working age 21 to 64 for each citizen over the age of 65. Today, 2014, which is just above that dotted red box, we have about 5.2, and by 2030, with no immigration, we'll be at 2.1. So these are quite startling statistics. It's all predetermined because you cannot go back 15, 16, 17 years and produce the babies because you can't wind the clock back. And this is where we are today. And therefore, we have to devise a strategy for moving forward. Fortunately, we are a multicultural society which is immigrant-based. And we draw our population from the great Asian civilizations, and we've been doing so over many years. Hence, we are not unlike, say, Japan, which is a very monocultural society, which finds it very difficult to bring in people and to add to the population in that way without really fundamentally changing the society. For us, even here in Singapore, when we bring in immigrants or workers from the same great Asian civilizations from which our population has come, we already begin to face friction. So you can imagine if Japan were to do that, the amount of frictions that they would face. So they essentially have a very difficult situation to try and overcome. Whereas I think because we are a multicultural society inherently, and inherently an immigrant society, we have a much better opportunity to try to address some of these issues through immigration. Now, this will help to ameliorate the numbers on the population side. And if you look at where we were in fertility rates, a 1.2 fertility means that 100 people in this generation will result in 60 people in the next, and 36 in the generation after that. That's what 1.2 fertility rate means. And so we just simply need to be able to make up for the numbers that we lack. We are trying to increase, this is a different form of productivity. I'm not quite sure Gillian was meaning that when she asked the question. But parenthood, marriage, parenthood, we are trying to encourage that as much as possible. And we are seeing some encouraging signs. I see many more three-child families, even more. I have a very young electorate in my constituency. So I see more of that, and so that's encouraging. But we will continue to have to make up with both immigrants who share our values and want to stay with us for longer term, as well as foreign workforce. And one of the reasons why we need a foreign workforce is because our population is actually becoming better educated. We expect a higher and higher percentage of Singaporeans, because of the success of our education system, to actually be taking up PMET jobs, professional, managerial, executive and technical jobs, yes, PMET jobs. So if you're going to be in a PMET job and you want to be a boss, who are you going to be the boss of? And who is going to do to help you and complement you in the work that you do? And as Chun Seng was saying, if you cannot find that kind of work here and you have good education, then you end up with your sons and your daughters going somewhere else to work. which is really not the desired outcome. And so we need a complementation. Julian was asking about productivity. I no longer chair the productivity committee. I passed it on to Taman at a very most propitious time, because we had just come out of the recession, and because of the the way that productivity goes down during a recession and it shoots up and you're coming out, I could declare victory and hand over to him. So he has the hard work to lift it. But this is something which needs to be done both at the policy level, and the policies we're putting in place for training, retraining, encouraging companies with PIC grants and so on. But it also requires really hard work on the ground to convince individuals. And this is what I think the unions also have been doing a very good job with. I'm the advisor to UE, the electronics union, and they have a very difficult time because that's one of the most rapidly churning over industries. A lot of changes taking place all the time, companies leaving, new companies coming in, and so there's a lot of training and retraining. And the unions and the employers work very closely together with the government agencies to try and facilitate that training and retraining. One of my saddest Meet the People session cases, this was about 10 years ago, was a lady who must have been in her late 30s. She came to see me because SATS, the flight kitchen, had just finished building the second flight kitchen, SATS 2. And she had been posted there. And she said, no, I can't deal with this because all this equipment is computerized. I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing, and this is all too complicated for me. So I said, how do you want me to help you? She said, can you please help me to write a letter to the company so that I can continue working where I was working before. So I tried to persuade her. I said, look, even if you work in the old flight kitchen, after they built the new one, they may well come and refurbish and re-equip the kitchen with new equipment. And so isn't it good that your company is sending you for training and so on? She was persuaded by the intellectual argument, but at the end of it all, she said to me, no, this is just too difficult. Can you please just help me to write a letter to the company and request that I stay where I am in my old job? So it requires hard work on the ground, talking to individuals and persuading them. And some of our union leaders, I think, have been really quite outstanding at doing that. I speak to some of the old UE union leaders, and they actually go down to the shop floor when there's a training course and talk to the individual workers on the shop floor. Because the individual workers have so much they have to work. Sometimes they work overtime, they've got families to look after, and so on. They have to do it one by one, retail. And that's a lot of hard work that's being done by our unions.
Paul, you've been waiting patiently.
My name is Paul Tambay. I'm a medical doctor, and I'm also a volunteer with a medical-related NGO. My question actually relates to this issue of generational transfer of costs, in particular with relation to healthcare. Because currently, as we know, the healthcare costs in Singapore are about $12 to $13 billion a year, of which the government gives about $4 billion. MediSave, MediShield, and MediFund make up about $2 billion in maximum. But in reality, for most of the people who are in hospital, who are facing expensive hospital bills, the cost of their hospital bill is actually paid by their children, either out of pocket or through their children's MediSave. In fact, in order to be entitled to use MediFund, you have to exhaust your children's MediSave account before you can be entitled to use MediFund. Now, I think MediShield Life is a great improvement because the catastrophic illness, the very high value illnesses will be taken care of. The concern is that with the deductible remaining at $2,000 or $3,000, it's still a significant burden on the next generation. And right now, we are in a situation where the 50 or 60-year-olds have got 5 or 6 children, so the burden is spread out amongst 5 or 6 children. But people in my generation were stopped at 2 generation. So the question is whether the current system, depending on MediShield Life for catastrophic illnesses, depending on the children, either through their MediSave or through out-of-pocket expenses, is actually sustainable because it places an extraordinary burden on the increasingly smaller families in Singapore in the future. Thank you.
I think Paul has pointed to a very interesting phenomenon which we have today, and that's the reason why we introduced the Pioneer Generation Package and also why we introduced MediShield Life. And also, let me talk a little bit about intergenerational transfers. Indeed, our pioneer generation grew up at a time in which they had very little savings. They had very little savings in their CPF, they had very little savings in their MediSave. Some of them didn't even subscribe to MediShield. And then later on in life, when they were unwell, there are all kinds of disqualifications and can't get full coverage for MediShield. And these were some of the reasons that motivated us to do Pioneer Generation Package as well as MediShield Life. And Pioneer Generation Package is basically focused on healthcare, medical care. And you know, I mean, if you just explain it simply, I mean, you can control how much you want to spend on a cup of coffee. You can buy a $10 cup of coffee, or you can buy a $1.50 cup of coffee. But even if you try your best to keep healthy, it's not always within your control that you will stay healthy and that you won't need some medical care. And this is something which I think worries a lot of our pioneer generation and worries the children too. And so we thought that instead of spreading our resources in other areas, we should really focus on healthcare so that our pioneer generation can sort of enjoy their golden years, silver years, with a little bit more reassurance without so much worry. And for their children too. So for the pioneer generation, this is specifically what we're doing. And this comes together with MediShield Life. Now, when we talk about intergenerational transfers, I think quite a number of the healthcare systems in the world do it in a rather irresponsible way because they do it by anonymous intergenerational transfer. That means you tax the next generation to spend on the healthcare of the previous generation anonymously without any sort of mutual obligation directly to each other. When you do it within the family, I think that is a much more natural it's a much more natural and organic way of doing it. And in fact, it's not something to be discouraged because even if you provide basic health care, it may well be that the children want to provide more. Even if you provide basic housing, it may well be that the children want to provide more. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. And within family groups, I think it's something to be encouraged and indeed laudable. And we should not, by socializing too much, remove that intergenerational mutual responsibility within families, because it is a very personal thing and it's not anonymized between generations as you would do in a tax and spend system. But in the design of the MediShield Life, we indeed are trying to avoid the intergenerational transfer. And we're doing it in this way. When MediShield was not compulsory, each age group had to pay the premium appropriate for the medical costs of that age group. Because otherwise, I will wait until I'm old, and then I will come in at a cheaper rate than the appropriate medical expenditure for that age group. So because MediShield, the current MediShield, is not compulsory, that had to be the design of MediShield. Otherwise, people will just opt out at a young age if you ask them to pay more, and opt in at an older age, if that's not properly, the premium is not properly actuarially calculated. But with MediShield Life, what has happened now is you've made it compulsory. And this is a very important feature about MediShield Life, and that's why we have to make it compulsory. When you make it compulsory, then you can do intergenerational transfer yourself, for yourself, by having yourself pay a higher proportion than needs be for that age group when you're young. And that makes sense because when you're young, you have earning capacity, you have excess, surplus, and you can actually pay more than you need to at that age group for your MediShield premiums. And so what you do is instead of having a slope like this, you adjust the slope so that you pay more when you're young, so that you need only pay less when you're older. So the intergenerational transfer now takes place within yourself. And I think that is quite fair. And so that intergenerational feature is a very important feature of the new MediShield Life. And as we transition from MediShield to MediShield Life, the Pioneer Generation Package will be a great help. Now, this issue of whether there should be an excess or not, that means a payment amount which individuals need to make for healthcare, I think that is a very important element. And the health economists in many countries find that a very important feature of our healthcare system, because there is a co-payment amount and there's a minimum amount, there's an excess below which the individual needs to pay. And that's quite an important element in encouraging responsible healthcare use. But without that, the health expenditure can easily blow away, and it's not clear that the health outcomes will be greatly improved even though the health expenditure improves. I was explaining, and that's one of the reasons why we are able to maintain MediShield and MediShield Life premiums at a very affordable rate. Without that structure in the system, MediShield premiums and MediShield Life premiums will go through the roof if you allow first dollar claims for healthcare. This is a very important feature of MediShield and MediShield Life, which I think many health economists find a very unique and important feature which we have in our healthcare system. I was talking to, we have to do this on a retail basis to explain to people what MediShield Life and Pioneer Generation Package is and so on. And I was at a void deck talking to some 40, 50 of my residents a couple of months ago. And she said, you know, our insurance system is terrible. You know, my mother has to pay more, you know, as she grows older, and she has to pay, you know, a couple of $1,200 or $1,500 a month for her insurance. And she's, you know, I think she was 73 years old or something. And then she says, you know, my daughter is studying in the US, and, you know, it's wonderful. Her healthcare insurance system covers everything from, you know, the first dollar. So I asked her, okay, how much does your mother, who's 73 years old, pay for her health insurance? And how much does your daughter pay for her health insurance at 23 years old? It turns out that what her daughter pays in 1 month is what her mother at 73 years old pays for 1 year. And that is indeed the impact of a health insurance system that is not designed to encourage sort of responsible behavior.
We have run out of time, but if you don't mind, we might extend for 10 minutes or so. Is there a question on that side? Yes, let's take that question.
We should give both of us an opportunity to round up at the end.
I'm aware that we are running out of time, so I hope this question will be worth your while. My name is Clarice Lam, and I'm teaching at Anglo-Chinese Junior College. So my key takeaway from today's event really has been that Singapore, due to its very exceptional conditions, the context that we face, has had to make very pragmatic choices in the past, and we may have to do so in the future. So this question has been inspired by a conversation at my table about Mr. Han Fuk Kwang's column yesterday in the Straits Times, in which he wrote about 3 dark secrets that Singapore has had in order to achieve the success that we have today, including income inequality. That's number 1. Growth at the expense of lowly paid foreign workers. That's number 2. And number 3 is political, to some degree, suppression. So my question is this. In the light of the general elections 2011 and the upcoming elections most likely next year or the year after, how can we accommodate the new norm of greater political diversity without compromising our survival? Yeah. Thank you.
Question. You want to take
Well,
that first?
maybe I take it first, then
Okay.
I see how Chun Seng wants to respond to it. Indeed, the choices that we had when we became independent 50 years ago were more stark. They had to do with survival. Our choices were more limited, and you had to go with what you had. It's a little bit like a Model T Ford. You can choose whatever color so long as it was black. That was what Henry Ford said. And by that means, he was able to provide motorcar transport. I just realized that I'm probably using a very bad example. I'm going to step on a big minefield here because I'm talking about cars. But anyway, by that example, he was able to provide mass transportation for many Americans, but they had to accept that the Model T Ford was black. And today, you actually have a much more diverse range of interests and views. And that is a luxury that we have, which we did not have in the earlier years. And I would say that there are 2 important caveats to that. One is that the assumption is that we will continue to be in this happy state where we don't encounter a major crisis. We will have all the resources that we want, and we will have all the time in the world to have discussions and before we decide. Second, that discussion and exchange of views is important, but it's a luxury which we have, and it's an important one when we are discussing in an academic environment, where we examine all possibilities. But you can see that even in a room like this, which is quite a variety of people, but even so, not such a great diversity of people, it's not easy to come to an agreement on exactly what it is that we should do. And people will leave feeling, oh, we should have done this, or we should have done that, or we should have done a bit more of this or a bit more of that. But in the end, the karma of anyone who's in government, either he runs the government or even if he runs a town council or whatever it is, he has to choose. He has to decide. He can't carry on the conversation indefinitely. Otherwise, you will end up like London, which has been discussing building a new airport for the last 30 to 40 years and still hasn't been built. And Heathrow Airport continues to be more and more crowded every year. So the situation has indeed changed. And I would say for the better. Because more people have views and useful views which can be tapped upon to actually improve the policy-making process and the choices that we have. But in the end, you have to, it's the karma of the government that they have to decide to do this or to do that. You may not always be able to do everything that everybody wants. And then it requires a certain political maturity on the part of everyone in Singapore to say, yes, okay, we've had a good discussion, let's go on, let's go ahead, and we move on, and we decide. This is not unique to the political arena. I mean, everyone faces it. You as a teacher, your predecessors had an easier time because the teachers were practically the only educated ones in the society. And the fathers and the mothers would send their children, probably sons rather than daughters, to school and say, "Teacher, can you please educate my child? I never had the benefit of education. If he is naughty, you please give him a tight slap. Tell me when he comes home, I'll give him a few more." And that was how things were settled. But today, you have parents who are well educated, and they will ask you, why have you taught my son or my daughter in this way? Isn't this wrong? Haven't you told them the wrong thing? Or shouldn't you be encouraging them to do something different? And you have to spend quite a lot of time, essential time, on the parent-teacher interactions in order to get alignment between the parents, the home, and the school in bringing up the child. And so a lot of this needs to go on today, and both in school, in governance, even our doctors face this. If you go and see a doctor, I think it's not unusual if the patient is checking up on the internet to see whether what the doctor is telling him is true. Or he's seeking multiple opinions at the same time that he's consulting the doctor. So things have changed. I think it's for the good, but we also need a certain mature political process in which we end up having good solutions which we can all go away with and say, okay, we accept it. Let's move on. And let's get it done as best as we can. Rather than to end up with diversity as an objective in itself and then ending up with gridlock as in a number of countries. You take some of the European countries, after an election, they're unable to form a government for months, sometimes almost a year. And I'm not sure that you really want to end up in a situation like that. But perhaps I leave it to Chun Seng if you have some comments on this.
Let me answer the question in two segments. The first issue has to do with diversity, and the second one about fundamentals and my own thoughts about it. Diversity in itself is not a weakness. Diversity in itself can be a strength. The key is not diversity per se. The key is how do we as a society achieve convergence after the sharing of those diverse views. And actually, because the world is so uncertain going forward, the more perspective we have, the more able we are to check our own blind spots as a society. The question is, do we have the mechanism, do we have the maturity to find convergence beyond diversity so that we can take our country forward? So this is the part that is most challenging. And it takes a certain maturity to have a give and take relationship, to sometimes to be a bit more circumspect that we may have a different view from someone else, but that doesn't necessarily always make us right. That perhaps before we shout down another person's view is to sit back and think, why is he or she taking that perspective? Is there a way, as Karl Marx would say, that there's a thesis, there's an antithesis. The question is, can we find the synthesis? It's easy to have a thesis and an antithesis. To find the synthesis is the challenge. In order for us to find that synthesis, then we have to put the greater good of our society ahead, the future of our country ahead, of our own preferences, desires, and so forth. That is easy to say, but not easy always to do. Because many people will champion for their own causes passionately, and so they should. But having championed for our own respective causes passionately, the question is, do we and are we able to embrace other people's differences in opinion, and if possible, find that synthesis and really take the country forward? If we can do that, then I think we will be much stronger for it. On the issues of fundamentals, in my many conversations with many young people, much younger than me, they say, we need a new narrative for our country. And I can understand and appreciate what they mean, and we will find some new way to galvanize our society who has gone beyond what you call the Maslow hierarchies of needs, the basic tiers, that we are now into a higher tier of Maslow hierarchy needs. That beyond security, safety, food, lodging, we have pretty much gone up the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And you'll be a more diverse population where we need to galvanize people to find convergence. I can understand that. But I always also share with them that we must not lose sight of some of the fundamentals that perhaps, as DPM would say, is the karma of our country. First, we need to make a living. If we can't make a living and provide the opportunities for our younger generation and our people, I don't think many people will treat our little red passport with much respect. Our Prime Minister get invited to the G20 conference, not because we are one of the G20s. Many people say that we have punched above our weight. Yes, we may have punched above our weight at this moment, but it's not a given that we will always and effortlessly be able to continue to punch above our weight. Effortlessly. I've never taken it for granted that we will always be as successful as we are now effortlessly. 50 years ago, if we were to name the 3 most successful Southeast Asian countries seen as the rising stars 50 years ago, I think Singapore won't be on the list. I think Ceylon, at that point in time, Burma, and maybe the Philippines would have been on that list. You know, so the tide of history comes and goes, and we should never be complacent that just because we are where we are today, that we will always be where we are tomorrow. So I think making a living. The second fundamental that before us and is our karma is that we have to take care of our own security and independence. And it goes back to the fact that we have never been an independent country in this part of the world for the last 500-600 years. Everyone else has an interest in our well-being, if you like. And it's just a fact of life. When in World War II, someone asked the Australians and the New Zealanders, why are they participating in the fight in Singapore when the Japanese were coming down the Malayan Peninsula? And the blunt answer from one of them was that whatever happens in Singapore, and if Singapore should fall, will have an impact on them. For us to be independent, for us to be able, when people tell us to jump, and we can say, ask why and not how high, I think it takes tremendous effort. So making a living, taking care of our independence and security. But the third set of fundamentals is always to keep our society together. In the past, in 1960s, our challenges in keeping the society together has to do with race, language, religion. It has also to do with the rich and the poor. Going forward, there will be new fault lines in our society. Some of it is internal, some of it is impacted by the larger forces around the world. We don't have our indigenous language. Even hard as MediaCorp tries, we can only produce so many local programs. Most of our programs and cultural influences come from the rest of the world. We will be impacted and buffeted by the forces that's impacting on the rest of the world. We can't be free from that. So the question is, going forward, what are the new fault lines that will threaten to pull our society apart? And how do we develop new structures, institutions to mitigate this? Take race and religion for example. It took us many years to arrive at where we are today, where we have the interracial religious confidence circle, the RRCCs. For us, that when something happens, we are able to react to it rationally as Singaporeans, not as Chinese, Indian, or Malay, as Singaporeans first. That took tremendous effort. Going forward, there will be new fault lines. The question is that will we be able to similarly put aside our individual agenda, come together, and perhaps develop new mechanisms for us to manage these new fault lines. If I may just share one very poignant example over the last 2 years. I think the memories of the Little India riot will still be fresh in many of our minds. It happened 2 Decembers ago, end of 2013. Many people were focused very much on the security situation in Little India during those critical hours, whether we were able to contain the riot, so on and so forth. Indeed, it was a dicey situation at Little India at that point in time. But I still remember on that night, I was covering the defense portfolio. The thing that went through my mind was not just what happened at Little India that night. What went through my mind was, will it spread? How would our Indians, Singaporean Indians, react to this? How would our Chinese react to this? If we go back history 50 years ago, and something like that happened, and the rumor spread that a Chinese bus driver has knocked down an Indian and killed an Indian, I'm not so sure that the reaction would have been similar to what we saw at the Little India riot in 2013. We have reached a certain stage of maturity, but we can never be complacent, because some of these things are very visceral. We never know when it will spark off again. But this is just one example of some of the fundamentals that we are still grappling with, and we should never take it for granted. And going forward, there will be other issues that might be as thorny as what race, language, and religion used to be. And we will have to find those mechanisms to resolve some of these internal social tensions that we will have within our society. So yes, we will need a new narrative because we have gone beyond the basic Maslow needs of the basic Maslow hierarchy in the lower echelons. We have more educated people, more diversity of views, greater aspirations for self-actualizations. Yes. But as we pursue all this, I think let us also not forget some of the fundamentals that our society has and will never go away to be successful and relevant as a small nation in the global competition, that we will not be a footnote in history, that we have to take care of our own sovereignty and security, that we have to constantly find mechanisms to resolve the inherent tensions that we have in our society on the social front, to pull everybody together and move forward as one united nation.
I'll have one last scintillating question that will allow DPM and Minister Chan to wrap up. If nobody is volunteering, can I call upon Singapore's leading public intellectual and the dean of, and my boss to ask just a brilliant summation that will give both DPM and Minister Chan a chance to synthesize.
You're asking him for brilliant summation or
That's
right.
Brilliant, scintillating question. You had a long walk.
Yes, it's on.
Sorry, I was genuinely jet lagging, by the way. No, I think this conversation has been fascinating because it demonstrates that Singapore is going through a major transition. And it's also clear that many Singaporeans feel a sense of anxiety about the future. So my question to both of you is, if you had to help to reduce this anxiety about the future among Singaporeans, what would you say to them?
Thank you. DPM, you want to go first? Or you? Okay.
I would say two things.
Synthesis, yeah.
I would say two things. The anxiety that Singaporeans face, depending on our station in life, is not always the same. If I have to divide our population into 3 segments, the lowest income will obviously fear whether their children can catch up in the next generation, even if they are poor this generation. The middle income will fear if they can catch up with the top 1/3, and if they can compete with the rest of the middle income in the region and beyond. Even the top 1/3 will be anxious because, unlike the past, where the economic cycles are much longer and more predictable, they will be concerned if they can entrench or retain their position as the top 1/3. My response to that is that I'm confident that if we can pull together as a nation, there is no challenge that we cannot overcome. We started with much less, with much more existential challenges to say in the 1965. The pioneer generation show us what can be done when they focus their minds and energies. There's no reason why our generation, with much more, no doubt having much more complex challenges, cannot overcome. The crux of whether we can overcome will depend on whether we can stay united as a people. The crux of whether we can stay united as a people will depend on whether we can share and have a sense of shared perspective of our common challenges, put aside our individual preferences at times, if you may, for the greater good, and to constantly defend and enlarge the common space that we have as Singaporeans. In order to do that, we have to stay rooted and yet constantly look for that forward-looking, inclusive identity, a set of ideals that will guide us going into the future, to always move together as a nation, to always do more for those with less, to always remember our station in life as a small country, and not to lose sight of some of these fundamentals. So I'm confident if we can do that.
Well, indeed the world has changed. And the old certitudes don't hold anymore. If you take, say, Japan as a model, the idea of a salaryman working lifelong employment in the same firm, the same job, same line of work, perhaps even the same line of work that his father or grandfather did in the same firm, doesn't hold anymore. And why is that? A number of reasons. One, we live a lot longer than we used to. As I said, the lifespans used to be shorter. People now live a lot longer and they work a lot longer. And so more of us will have a work and life shape that is more like that of a football player or a ballerina. And let me explain what that means. The normal, what we considered normal before, is that you start work, every year you get some increment and you get a promotion and you keep on getting more and more and more, and then you retire in a blaze of glory at the top of your job, at your maximum salary. And that has been a fairly typical model, say, if you want to take the sort of example of that, the Japanese salaryman. But we live longer, we now have different needs in our different life phases, and we may well be moving into a type of life cycle where we work very hard, we have our maximum earnings at a certain age where our requirements are at the maximum. When we have children, when and our children have needs, maybe when our parents have needs, and then after that, when your children are independent, perhaps you want to continue being economically active and work, but in a different kind of job, in a different kind of pace, with a different kind of pressure, part-time, whatever. So it's a little bit like a ballerina or a football player where you sort of have your peak earning years, and after that, you know, as a football player, you may become a coach. Sometimes you go and manage a big football club, but sometimes you go and manage a school team, or you go and run a pub or something. But, you know, save your money, don't spend it unwisely. And this is your life cycle. And ballerinas also are like that. You can't be at the top flight your whole life. And I think that the life cycles, the nature of work, means that each of us has to make this adaptation. I think for our teachers in the schools, we had a teacher from ACJC just now, it's a good example. We have teachers who have retired as principals or heads of department, and they come back to teach again, but not as principals or heads of department. They come back as teachers. So somebody else becomes a principal or head of department. But a wise principal will say, you know, Mr. So-and-so, or Mrs. So-and-so, Madam So-and-so, you have a lot of experience. Can you just please take my weakest PSLE class and make sure they pass math this year? And that may be wonderful for her or him, for the kids, and for our system as a whole. But he or she doesn't need to be the principal or the head of department. It requires some adjustment of egos and pace of life and so forth. But I think many of us will now go through this transition cycle. And it's partly because of the kind of work that we do as well. So I think some of the anxiety is due to that. The other anxiety, of course, is change. The nature of jobs change very rapidly. What you have learned and trained in before may become obsolete within your lifetime, within your working life, maybe 2-3 times. I studied computing when I was in school, in university. We didn't even have we didn't have, the IBM PC had not been invented yet when I started learning computer science. And the amount of power in the machine in my department, in the computing science department, is a lot less than what is in my handphone today. It's completely different. The technology has changed. The life cycle of companies too has changed. The concept of lifetime employment really is called into question when people live longer than companies. It used to be that companies live longer than people, many generations. I mean, you have seen all the, you know, the stories about how many companies in the Fortune 500 were there X years ago and are still there today. So I think these are some of the anxieties that we are all facing. There are also anxieties about values and how they're changing. The old certainties and certitudes and values seem to be different. I had an old German friend who was a general, and he said in the old days, values were very clear. If a young man or a young woman had a problem with, you know, say, boy-girl problem, if he asked his elder brother or sister, he asked his parents, he asked his teacher, he asked an uncle, he asked his parents, of course the parents would be the last person they asked, they will all more or less give him the same answer, give him the same sort of guidance about how he should deal with this, because values were more consistent and generally accepted and uniform in society. Now there's a confusion. If he were to ask all of them, he might get the same answer, but that answer will be, well, you decide for yourself. And so what does he do? And these are also some of the anxieties that not just young people, but adults face today in society. What? The old certitudes are no longer there. So how do we help people deal with these anxieties? One of them is a functional one, which is greater training and retraining opportunities. This is what we always, the mantra that we always put out, but this is real. And when I was the Minister for Education, I had a choice to make. We had increasing cohorts for the period of time coming to the polytechnics. And we could see that was the 1988 to 1997 cohort. And we had to decide, do you just allow more students into each of the 4 polytechnics then, or do you build a 5th new one? And we decided to build a 5th new one because I said it will come in useful for continuing education and training for people in the future. And we will need such institutions and facilities for the future. So continuing education and training is an important feature of dealing with some of these anxieties. And that has to become an ingrained part of all of us. If you look at the evolution of education, it went from mass primary education to mass secondary education to today we actually have achieved mass tertiary education in Singapore. But the next evolution is mass continuing education. And no country has reached that today. And this is certainly one evolution and one innovation which we need to make. Mass continuing education. So that's functional. The other part is how to share the risk a little bit more. And this is indeed what we're doing. With a number of the things that we're doing, MediShield Life is actually risk pooling across the population. A number of these things, but in a sustainable and responsible way. Remember, a promise is worth something only if you can keep it. If you're writing a promise with a check being written on somebody else, that's not really a promise at all. And so, more risk pooling, more helping each other as to share the risks of the vicissitudes of life. And third, we really need to remain united and care for each other as a society, like family. And it's possible to do so because Singapore is small. We are not a huge country of 200-300 million or a billion or even 50-60 million. We are still a small country, 3.5 million Singaporeans. Surely we can care for each other. And we see examples of that every day. Our grassroots leaders, people in the VWOs, working selflessly for others, deriving their happiness and satisfaction not from what direct benefit they get, but deriving their happiness from seeing other people's happiness. And if we can have more of that in our society, I think that's good for us. So I would say to deal with the anxieties, these are some of the things that we can do, but it's not just what I say or what the government does, but it's also what the individual does. The individual also has a responsibility for this, in making sure that he remains employed, in making sure that he makes use of those safety nets that are there in a responsible way, and that he himself also contributes to that general happiness, and we hope he derives more happiness and less anxiety from doing that as well. So I would say to deal with that anxiety, let's go forward together. The road is easier, the load is lighter, and we have a more jolly and happy time when we move forward together.
Thank you, DPM, and thank you all of you. It's been a very long day, and I'm amazed that so many of you have stuck with it right through early in the morning, 8:30 until now, 5:30, and I think it's because, in part, we've had two very sterling performances from both Minister Chan and DPM. This is the 50th anniversary of Singapore, and this conference was pegged as part of the 50th anniversary commemorations. And I think all of you will agree that it has been an interesting conversation, an interesting series of speakers, and an interesting debate. We have heard a variety of views, but as DPM and Minister Chan indicated, despite the diversity, I think there is a certain underlying confidence and agreement about the basics. Nobody, after 50 years, doubted that this should be and shall be forever an independent sovereign state. And that is, in the context of our history, a very young history of just 50 years, quite an amazing achievement. So thank you very much for being here, and thank Minister Chan as well as DPM Theo for having agreed to grace this occasion. Thank you very much.